Hello, we have Christopher Black today. It's the 22nd of January. It's a privilege to have Christopher Black on this interview. Christopher is an internationally renowned defense lawyer and he served in various international criminal tribunals. So I'm going to ask Christopher for his expert view on these following questions. Christopher, first of all, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for having me again, Finian. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Chris. Chris, this week past, the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, reiterated a demand for war crimes prosecutions against the Russian leadership, President Vladimir Putin foremost. Christopher, can I just ask you, what is the feasibility of such a move? And secondly, if you can follow up on that, what's the implications, the political implications of that kind of demand in terms of resolving the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, the first question has two components to it, because legally it's not feasible whatsoever, but practically it is, as they've proven in the past with the establishment of the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda back in the 90s, and the Sierra Leone and the Cambodia tribunal and so on. They were all illegal under international law, but they were established. So they could do this again, but it would not be legal, because the only international criminal court is the International Criminal Court based in The Hague, established by the Rome Treaty, which is governed by now the Rome Statute, or the Statute of the ICC. And as Mr. Khan, the present prosecutor of the ICC, stated, any attempts by the Europeans or the Americans to establish a separate tribunal to make concoct allegations against Russia would undermine the ICC itself, which has that role, and is in conducting its own investigations into what's going on in Ukraine, based on a letter that Ukraine sent to the ICC some years ago, back I think 2011, in which they, although they're not a party to the treaty, therefore not under the ICC jurisdiction, gave it permission to investigate. That hasn't really gone anywhere, but still, the ICC would be the only court which would have any jurisdiction, and it has no jurisdiction over Russia or the United States or China. We have to remember that the Germans, Ms. Baerbock, who's pushing for this a new version of these ad hoc tribunals, or European tribunal or American European tribunal, it was the Germans who also pushed for the establishment of the ICTY, the Yugoslav tribunal. It was Hans-Dieter Genscher, in a speech to the Parliament in Ottawa in Canada in 1993, who pushed this idea. And they were behind, with the Americans, the establishment of the Yugoslav tribunal, which was used to condemn Milosevic and eventually murder him, assassinate him, in my view, and to use it to put out propaganda against the Yugoslavian government and the Serbs in particular, and to cover up the war crimes of NATO and the United States in their aggression against Yugoslavia. And the same thing happened with Rwanda. We can go into that, it's a different story, but similar things happened in the Sierra Leone tribunal and the Cambodia tribunal.
Christopher, you served.
And these are all illegal under international law, because the United Nations Charter does not permit such tribunals to be established.
Mm-hmm. And Christopher, you served as a defense counsel in the Yugoslavia War Crimes Tribunal, didn't you?
Well, tangentially, because I was one of the advisors to President Milosevic during his trial before he was killed in 2006. I wasn't directly involved there, but I was part of the legal team. I was head of the International Defense Committee, which defended him. He had two lawyers, Serbian lawyers, there all the time defending him, but we consulted with him often. But my main role was at the Rwanda tribunal. I spent most of my time there. I was also asked to be involved in the trial of General Mladic, but the Serbian secret police put an end to that. That's another story, but they prevented me from being there. And with Alex Mazayev, a Russian lawyer, we were told by the tribunal we would not be allowed to take a position there because of our views of the tribunal as being illegal. So they wouldn't allow us to represent those people.
Yeah.
But going back to the legality of it, the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda were ostensibly created under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which indicates their political role, because that article or chapter of the UN Charter deals with international peace and security. So, that chapter does not permit the establishment of any legal mechanisms to try anybody for anything. But that's what they did. I suppose they could, they won't be able to do that again, because at that time Russia was under Yeltsin's control and went along with it, and China got fooled into it somehow. That wouldn't happen again. So now they want to create some sort of tribunal created by the EU, but it would have no international real jurisdiction. It wouldn't have any authority. And the other problem is that not only does it have no mechanism to create such a thing, it's also illegal in the sense that court, like the ICC, exists not only to punish people or judge people, but also as a deterrent to say to people, if you engage in crimes, be warned, you could be charged by us. So you cannot create a court after the fact. You cannot say there's a crime, now we're going to create a court to punish it, because the people you're accusing did not know they were in jeopardy of being tried by such a court, and therefore couldn't govern their actions accordingly, because no such court existed for them to face. So you cannot create a court for a criminal after a crime is committed. So that's also that problem. And as we know from the other tribunals and the statements so far by Zelensky and the Americans and Europeans, it will just be a propaganda exercise, which will then be used. The second part of your question, it will be used to prevent negotiations between the United States and Russia. Because as they said with Milosevic and Saddam Hussein, you cannot negotiate with criminals or war criminals. And that's the mantra. And that's part of Zelensky's peace deal, that they want he's only going to negotiate with Russia if Putin is charged, and so on and so forth. They're deliberately creating an obstacle to any peace negotiation. They do not want peace with Russia. That's quite clear to me. They want this war to continue.
And the legal mechanism that they're referring to, do you think it's just another branch of their hybrid warfare? They're just politicizing the legal system to go after Russia for naked political objectives, to crush Russia or to undermine Russia.
Yes, indeed. As many people have pointed out, all these nations are concocting or thinking of this idea, they're themselves guilty of aggression. Every one of them took part in the aggression against Yugoslavia and the invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the aggression against Russia and the aggression against the Donbass people in eastern Ukraine for the last 8 years, since 2014. So they have no moral right to charge anybody with anything, since they're all guilty of the crime they allege against Russia.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, the Western media won't repeat any of these, won't remind people of this. And so they will engage in this exercise as pure propaganda, just as they did against the Chinese with the London Tribunal, the so-called Uyghur Tribunal. Last year and the year before, they've had 2 series of tribunals in London run by Jeffrey Nice, who's also going to be involved in, I believe, this new tribunal. He's been asked to be involved, and was also the prosecutor against Milosevic for NATO in the Yugoslav tribunal. So he's their man they go to when they want to stitch up somebody in a show trial. So they create these tribunals for 3 reasons: A, to put out false propaganda against the persons they're charging, which would be Putin and the government of Russia. And now we see Belarus also. Lukashenko is also included in this. And to cover up their crimes, so people don't know what their role is, and to confuse people about what this war is all about. So it has real 3 purposes, and it's basically propaganda. That's what we're dealing with. And it's very troubling, because we know what happened with Yugoslavia and Rwanda. Those countries were destroyed partly through this propaganda, by convincing people that you could not defend Milosevic or the Yugoslav government of Rwanda because they were criminals. They were nasty people. They were fascists. And And that's what's going to be said about President Putin and the entire Russian government and anybody in Russia that defends this military operation in Ukraine.
So it's a way of justifying NATO's weaponization and military involvement in Ukraine. Is that what you're saying, Chris? It's just a cover for this horrendous militarization of Ukraine and prolonging of the war.
Yes, exactly. And I think since we now see that the Russian military operation is having a series of successes, and everybody assumes a major offensive is coming fairly soon, the Ukrainian army is basically destroyed in large part. So now they're scraping together what they've got, and the NATO and the Americans and the Europeans are panicking, it looks to me. So they want to up the ante by convincing people in their own countries that they're doing the right thing, that their continuation of this war is justified, and practicality and consequences indicate that we should back off this war and stop this war because it's just ruining everything around the world. So they need an excuse not to do that. They want to continue the war. And this is going to be one of the arrows in their quiver, which they're going to shoot into the air, preventing any negotiations. I mean, it's quite clear that, to me, that Zelensky was told to put in his 10 demands for negotiations with Russia back in November, that President Putin and his coterie be charged with war crimes. But not him, of course. No, not the United States. And this is impossible. And the Russians won't take part in such a farce. No real lawyers will take part. No lawyers who really want to defend anybody will take part in this farce. But they will. But that's what they're going to do. As the London Tribunal condemned China with genocide.
Yeah.
And and it didn't get much attention in the press, but they've been using the London Uyghur Tribunal to condemn China in article after article after article, quoting the London Tribunal as finding China guilty of genocide against the Uyghurs, even though it's all false.
Yeah.
And that's what they're going to do here. So you see it being used against Russia and China, and they'll expand these things. They're expert at this.
Christopher, what do you make of the allegations of war crimes against Russia? I mean, the Western media are full of claims that the Russian military are inflicting, huge war crimes against the Ukrainian civilian population. What do you make of it from what you see?
Well, from what I'm not there, so I don't know firsthand. But from what the reports we're getting, it seems to me and many others that Russia has done its best to only attack military targets. Yes, civilians have been killed in as what Americans would call collateral damage from bombings and strikes and so on. A lot of them but a lot of the allegations like Bucha and things like that were quite clearly false flags or concocted, fabricated events, which we know the Canadian Army just released a series of documents about the fake attacks by the Serbs on Croats and Bosnians in Bosnia and Yugoslavia in the 1990s. That a lot of the allegations against the Serbs they knew then were fake, were fabricated. But that's what they're doing. They're experts at this. They have experts that concoct these so-called crimes. But by and large, Russia has tried to. And part of the reason its military mission in the first few months was slow for some people was that they were trying not to hurt civilians and hurt infrastructure. They were trying to go very carefully, step through and try and defeat the Ukrainians. But that's gone by the boards now since they attacked the Crimea Bridge and so on and so forth in Russia. But I don't see any real evidence of any deliberate war crimes by Russia against Ukrainian civilians. But we do see a lot of evidence of war crimes committed by the Ukrainians. First of all, torture of Russian prisoners, which they've actually bragged about, murder of Russian prisoners, prisoners of war against the Geneva Conventions. We've seen them murder civilians. To the last few days in Odessa, Kiev, Kharkov, and other places, Zaporozhye, the secret police are rounding up people, searching houses and stopping people on the streets, and they shoot people. I mean, people are being executed. Soldiers who don't want to fight are executed by the Nazi battalions. So if war crime charges should be laid, they should be laid against other people, not Russia. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Russia is trying to create its own war crimes tribunal. The Donbass republics are. Where that is, I do not know. But so you have the situation where the propaganda is being used to confuse the situation. Nobody knows what's really happening. But unless you look, I mean, you can look and you can find out what's really happening. Mm-hmm. But most people just read the Western media and the mass media, and they believe what they're told on the BBC and CBC and CNN and so forth. Mm. So it's very dangerous what's going on, and I think Russia can win this war, but what the consequences will be, since they don't want to let go, they really do want to destroy Russia. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that worries me about how far they're willing to go. As Medvedev and many other people have warned the last couple of weeks where this may be going.
Yeah, and just at a time when diplomacy should be urgently explored, these calls for war crimes prosecutions are precluding any kind of political diplomatic resolution. And there's a huge background to that, as you well know, with Russia putting forward quite reasonable proposals for a security treaty for Europe before this war erupted last February. And those kind of diplomatic initiatives are just being completely prevented or suppressed by these calls for war crimes prosecutions. I mean, it's criminalizing Russia as a state, which by definition then makes any kind of diplomacy completely invalid.
That's right. They're trying to criminalize Russia as a state. And in fact, this is a modern American method since Saddam Hussein, in the wars in the past centuries, people would conquer a country but they would then treat with the leadership of that country and come to some peace treaty or some resolution of the problem afterwards. But the Americans are now taken the step in the last 30 years of refusing to treat with people, enemies they deal with or conquer or win over. They now try to convince the people that these leaders are common criminals. That there can be no negotiations whatsoever. There has to be a complete diktat of victory and their terms, unconditional terms. Mm-hmm. They did it with Saddam Hussein. They hanged him, Milosevic, and many other people. And they're trying to do that with President Putin, with President Xi Jinping as well. So, and yet it's them that's committed most of the crimes in the last, we can go back to the 1998, but anyway, and further. Yeah. But yes, there's no diplomat, there's no statesman in the Western nations which are capable or have the courage to carry forward any sort of concrete peace proposals to Russia. I mean, Russia, as you said, stated in December before the operation began, quite reasonable, concrete terms. Do this, do this, do this, and everything's fine. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there were no negotiations. Instead of the Americans sitting down and saying, okay, well, let's talk about this, there was no talk whatsoever. The Americans just rejected it out of hand because they wanted this war. Mm-hmm. And it's quite clear that they want to take over Russia and break it up into small pieces and exploit its resources, and they're desperate to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's partly why Germany goes along. Although the German situation is complex, since they're refusing to send tanks, there seems to be some struggle inside Germany itself, in the government, and different factions about how far they can push Russia. And that is sort of encouraging in a way that perhaps that may be the first signs of a break in NATO and the EU about this war. Mm-hmm. But we have people like Baerbock pushing for the ultimate.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you got German army generals calling for a restraint, which is very, very odd.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder who's kind of, forming Baerbock, the German foreign minister's agenda. I mean, is she being led by planners in Washington? I mean, where does she get these ideas from?
Yeah. Well, we don't know. I mean, Germany is still an occupied country. So, I mean, there's still big American presence there. I mean, that physical presence of the U.S. armed forces in Russia and Germany can be seen as a physical threat against the German government. I mean, what do they do if they just said, we're not going to go along with this? We're going to conclude a peace treaty ourselves with Russia. We're out of this war. We're not going to support. In fact, we're going to support Russia. What would happen? How soon would it be before those forces in Germany strike, and there's a coup or something? You have to. People wonder why the German government is so weak. Why it didn't complain about the North Sea explosion of the pipeline. I don't think the German position is very. Is one I'd like to be in myself, because they're between a rock and a hard place. They don't want to face. Scholz doesn't want to face up against Russia in another war. They know what happened before. But they're also afraid of the United States. So the struggle that's taking place is very interesting. But it's also very dangerous. It's like a powder keg. You don't know what's going to go off next.
Well, from what you've said, Christopher, I mean, that's I think the takeaway, that the NATO agenda, and I presume the Americans are leading that agenda, and German ministers like Baerbock are following the line. But the implication is that this war is going to get worse, at least in the short term, until Russia has some kind of decisive victory in Ukraine. But the calls for prosecution of Russian government as war criminals doesn't bode well for a diplomatic off-ramp, a diplomatic solution. No, it doesn't. Everything indicates that they don't want a diplomatic solution, that they want to continue this war no matter what happens in Ukraine. And as the Russians have said several times, the war in Ukraine is just part of the war against the United States. There's also the front in Syria, which has to be dealt with. They're moving their ships on the high seas. The Admiral Gershkov, I mean, Russia's taking action, setting things up. Ukraine is just a regional, local war for them. And it's only part of the war, because they now see that this is a war of the United States against Russia in a very general sense. So this is just part of it. And really, you can see that the Ukrainian army is part of NATO. It's a NATO army. And for all intents and purposes, they are fighting NATO, despite their claims they're not. But even if Russia is victorious, which they will be in Ukraine at some point, that doesn't end the war with the United States. That's going to go on. And it's going to go on in other areas and other regions. And we don't know what's going to happen. That's what's also very dangerous about this. Things can happen in the Far East and Central Asia. Things can happen in North America. We don't know what Russia will do when it's being pushed against the wall. And it's being pushed against the wall. Yeah. And they keep warning the world, don't push us against the wall. Christopher Black, thank you for your insights, Christopher. Some real, serious food for thought there. So thank you very much, Chris. You're welcome. Thank you for having me again. It's good to see you.